Hello and welcome to Getting the Answers. Here today once again with me, Anavultus, and
Hello, everybody. I'm the breakdown with WB or the breakdown with Berckenhoff. I'm happy to be here.
great. So today our topic is going to be First Amendment audits. An interesting topic that in recent years such events have become quite more popular.
Yes, this is somewhat similar to, well, not somewhat similar to it. It has the same sort of feel to it of sovereign citizens that we have also discussed. But I would say, and I don't think it's really a far-fetched thing to say to kind of start off this topic by saying that this one seems to be a lot more based on actual laws than, say, sovereign citizens. Now, how they end up going about it can sometimes be similar to similar tactics that sovereign citizens use, but this one seems to be much more grounded on actual law than, say, sovereign citizens.
Yes, I think that that is perhaps a first impression that some people would have is that First Amendment auditors seem superficially to have some similarities with sovereign citizens. However, I would say that when you actually dig into the movement and what exactly they're doing, it's actually very different substantially.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know what a First Amendment audit is, a First Amendment audit is a situation wherein a private citizen takes it upon himself to go to a public building or to meet a public official or to go to a public place and simply check out to see how public officials respond to behavior that they consider to be defended under the First Amendment, Second Amendment, etc. And this also sometimes extends to also seeing if in the interaction the public officials also respect the Fourth and Fifth Amendments that might also come into discussion at those points as well. So it is essentially a way that some citizens take upon themselves to see if public officials are respecting their rights and to hold their government accountable. Now, of course, I will say that there's a wide range of tactics used in these First Amendment audits. Some of them are entirely legal and not in dispute at all, as for whether it is appropriate conduct, and other kinds actually end up falling into a bit of an ignorance of certain aspects of the law, and they tend to sometimes fall afoul of certain laws that they might not have been aware of, or they might be misinterpreting how the courts interpret their rights to be protected, and therefore they might fall afoul of such things.
Right. As with any movement, you have the people that take it in certain perspectives. And we kind of said the same thing about sovereign citizens, and you kind of already hinted at it. But you have some people that are extremely knowledgeable and, let's just say, go about it the right way. And you have people that are somewhat knowledgeable and go about it the wrong way. And then you have people that are not knowledgeable and go about it the wrong way. Are in some cases probably the right way, just they don't know. There's many layers to a topic, especially on something like this.
Yeah.
uh yeah.
Yeah. So a way that such a thing might usually happen is perhaps a person goes out with a camera and from a sidewalk records a police building or a courthouse and the comings and goings of a public building. And then eventually, and not always, but eventually, at least in the videos that tend to get published, a policeman will approach this person and ask what their business is, ask them what they're doing, why they're doing it. They might ask for their identity. And usually, what will happen is that they will continue recording and they will do something that is called ID refusal, where because they if they ask it and they're not in trouble, that is, they're not being seen as someone who is committing a crime, they therefore exercise their right to not identify themselves in that situation. And of course, to some policemen, this seems a bit suspicious, and therefore it can lead to further questioning. And in some instances, the policemen end up attempting an arrest, or let's say this person has actually entered a public building and is doing this. They might trespass the person from the property, or if the person is looking at a crime scene, they might get that person for obstruction. And in some cases, depending on the circumstances, because somebody might actually be doing something criminal and they might be simply using this as an excuse. In some circumstances, the arrest is legitimate and no rights might have been violated, and in other circumstances, it is upheld in the courts that the arrest was perhaps illegitimate and that the rights of the supposed auditor in this situation might have been violated. So some examples of court rulings and of decisions that have been made and of interpretations of laws that are very common. And of course, it is important to understand that different jurisdictions have different laws. It is generally understood that in a public forum, people don't have a legal expectation of privacy. That means if somebody is simply recording, let's say on a sidewalk, and they're not obstructing anybody's path on the sidewalk, the person can record any person who is traveling on the sidewalk or in the public forum or anywhere that is visible from such a public forum, because as part of the freedom of the press in the First Amendment, that is a right that they have. And while some people might not like being recorded, they don't have a right to not be recorded in a public place. Although I will say that for many people doing public recordings, they do consider it courteous to avoid recording people that don't want to be recorded.
Right, that's kind of a courtesy thing for sure, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about certain examples a little bit more into this video. But I just had one other thing to add on what you were kind of talking about there. But many times when you just see the First Amendment auditors, you don't necessarily see their walks around buildings more than you see inside the building. Because really that's kind of more of the juicy part to go on YouTube and more interesting part for people to watch. But a lot of them bring up the point that cameras have become so popular now. Everybody has a cell phone, or at least most people have a cell phone. And all of the cell phones have cameras, and therefore you can video with your cell phone. Now, some of these auditors may not use their cell phone for videos, I don't know, but we all have the capability to video from it. So a lot of them bring up that as a point about what they're doing, and what you were kind of mentioning earlier, the fact that if you're on a sidewalk in a public area, you may not necessarily want to be on film, yes, but you could be on film, and it's practical to think that way. It's not like the cameras you had to use were, huge, bulky movie type of cameras.
Yeah. And I think something that's very important to understand is that while public property is something that is very well established in US law, it is important to understand that most places make a distinction between what is a public forum and a non-public forum. For example, let's say a sidewalk is considered to be a public forum because it is available to all people at all times of the day, and there's no reasonable reason for someone to be restricted from walking on a sidewalk except for in extraordinary circumstances. For example, if, let's say, there's a shootout happening between the police and some criminals, and somebody's walking by, the police say, please stay away from this area. We might be making an arrest, or there's a shootout or something. Then I think it's reasonable to say that the person might not actually have the prerogative to travel there anyway, because that might be obstructing the functions of the police department. So within any law, there's always a sort of reasonableness qualification happening there. Or, for example, a courthouse, many courtrooms, people aren't allowed to record, or if somebody is allowed to record, it has to be someone officially recording. Or obviously, if a public building is closed at certain times, those are times in which the general public would not be able to enter that building. Or if there's restricted access areas of public buildings, those are considered non-public forums. That is, people who don't have a particular business being there as determined by the people operating the building might not have the right to access those areas. And it is generally understood that such restrictions are not in violation of the First Amendment. And I know that there are some people that do consider such restrictions to be in violation of the First Amendment, but what you'd have to do is you'd have to make a court case and challenge that. And so far, it hasn't been something that's really been challenged. And I know that there are people trying to challenge it, but until it is something where the court specifically says that it is something that you can do, you have to follow the statutes if you want to be lawful as a citizen.
Right. Like, I kind of think of it in this way a lot of times. Like, if you're recording, at a park or something, right? And you're recording, your family having fun, maybe it's a reunion or something, and in the distance you see, a crime happening. Usually you want to turn your camera over if you see, the police being involved. Now, yeah, okay. Let's mention the police, because if you see a crime, people would probably record it. That's just the way people are. But if the police are involved directly with the crime, in other words, trying to stop it, I don't think that many people would just start to record that. So
I think people would record that. If they see
a
a police action happening, people would record it. And courts have upheld that people have the right to record public officials and police officers doing their work in a public place. So when the police are doing something, if you're not directly interfering with what the police is doing, then you have the full right to record. Now, if, let's say, the police have pulled someone over and they're doing an arrest, and you record, and then you walk up and you get really close to the police, it can be a safety concern for the police, so they will tell you to back off. And then if you refuse to back off, then that might be a situation where they might make an arrest. Not because you're recording them, but because you're getting really close to them and they're not comfortable with that if they're making an arrest. And I know that some people put out the line, well, maybe they're trying to hide their misdeeds. Maybe they're doing something wrong and they want to hide it. Well, that could be true. It is also true from the police's perspective that you don't want random people standing right behind you when you're conducting an arrest where you don't know what their intentions are.
Right.
I think it is a general safety concern. Now, if there's no actual arrest being made, no criminal event, and it's just somebody filming on the street, or there's no reason why the tensions would be high, then the police don't really have a concern, and they don't have a particular interest in getting people away, except for maybe their personal preference, which then doesn't factor into the law.
Right.
And therefore, it is important to understand that the police have certain policies and safety procedures that they go through when they're making an arrest or when they're securing a crime scene. And you need to be aware of the particular laws in your jurisdiction if you're going to watch the police, because there's many cop watchers, which is not the same thing as a First Amendment auditor. A cop watcher is just somebody that watches the police as the police does various things, whereas the First Amendment auditor might be more prominent. They might be more forward in such a situation and try to garner more information. And some of them might even try to establish contact with the police officers at a scene. And of course, that is a situation where the actual audit ends up going down, where depending on how the police respond, the auditor might pass or fail the police.
Right. I think that's a good distinction to make as far as the difference between just videoing in public to the goal that First Amendment auditors have. Because in a large way, I do think that they're there to try to provoke a response. Now, you can look at some of their websites and whatnot that say that that's not ultimately their focus. It's more to make sure, the police are doing their job, or the courthouse is doing its job, or whatever, public office is doing its job right. But I do think that they ultimately want to test the boundaries just a little bit to perform their test. And I think you can see that with more examples than you do with other. You see that more in the examples that you can find.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's interesting is that I think that there are some auditors who are very honest, who are not trying to get confrontations for views or for satisfaction, but there are some who are indeed trying to provoke a response. They're trying to gain views. They're trying to gain popularity. They're trying to perhaps escalate a situation. And those people are frequently referred to by their opponents as frauditors, because their actions in relation to First Amendment audits are seen as fraudulent in some way. And that would be maybe because they seem to be more interested in getting a situation that'll get views, or a situation that they can escalate into something interesting to watch, a spectacle. Or they perhaps behave in a way that really wastes the time of the police, or that is rude to other members of the public. Or in a way that, let's say you go into a DMV and you start recording, and while you might have, depending on the jurisdiction, the right to record in a DMV, it would be very decent to not record the various persons in the DMV, because they might be filling out a government form which might have sensitive information on there. And if you capture that on video, you can easily lend aid to identity theft. And while there's no expectation of privacy in a public place, legally speaking, it is still a common decency that you wouldn't go out of your way to compromise somebody else's privacy in such a way that could lead to identity theft. So in that situation, you would want to avoid recording what people are doing, and more record the actual public officials, or what is, or the way the building is, perhaps what the public officials are doing. And I've seen it a couple of different times where a public official will be working on some document of some kind, and they'll say that it's restricted, that somebody's not allowed to look at it. And then what the First Amendment auditor does is he immediately points the camera directly at the document and then uses there's no expectation of privacy in a public place, you need to create your own privacy as an excuse to specifically look at something that they shouldn't really be looking at. And while it is legal in theory to do this, depending on the jurisdiction, of course, it still is considered a pretty scummy thing to do. What you should instead do is not look at it and inform the person so that they know to be safer, because that's the decent thing to do. If you're not supposed to be seeing a certain document because it could contain sensitive information, instead of looking at the document and informing the person and essentially taking advantage of the person's mistake, and you should instead not look at it and inform the person. That would be the decent thing to do. And there are some auditors who are very courteous, who are very decent, who inform officers without taking advantage of their mistakes. And I think that there is a very clear distinction between this, between an honest auditor and what people would refer to as a frauditor.
Right. Unfortunately, most of the time, any type of manufactured drama or response is usually going to get more views on YouTube. So you can see the motivation of doing something like that, because it just gets more views.
Yeah.
More educational things usually don't get that as many views. So.
Or here's another one. There's a courthouse maybe, and it says no cameras on a sign, okay? And what they do is they have their camera on, and they can film from outside because it's perfectly legal, but then they go into the building with the camera still on, and the person at the security checkpoint tells them, you're not allowed to record in here. And there's a sign even that says they're not allowed to record. Mm-hmm. Now, if you do seriously think that you have a right to record, then the audit should have been failed from the sign in the first place. You could simply say, there's a sign here that's violating my rights, and then you put in a formal complaint. And that would be the proper thing to do, because if the audit has already failed, why would you double fail? You might go into the building not recording and ask them about the policy, because you don't want to fall afoul of the law. So you comply with the policy while also being critical of it, so that you don't have the appearance of a bad faith actor, as in somebody who's perhaps lawless, somebody who's not actually interested in the law, somebody who's simply breaking policies and violating policies in order to garner a response. And you might say, but it's unconstitutional, and I have the right to do this. I have the right to do this. Well, the problem is the court might not agree with you. The judge might not agree with you. And laws are only as effective as they are enforced. And even if you might have a right that is guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, that you might have the ability to record in a particular place, what you do is you challenge that in a way that isn't also going to get you in trouble in different ways. And unfortunately, I've seen certain individuals not do this. I've seen certain individuals intentionally violate policies, and then they probably didn't put a formal complaint in, because if they actually put formal complaints in, if they actually did something to help resolve the problem, then they probably wouldn't be able to make more videos because the problem would be resolved. So, so that's why these people are referred to as frauds.
Right. Mm-mm. And that's mostly why a lot of these videos you do see from courthouses are from weird angles. I don't think it takes a rocket science to figure it out, but usually those videos are not really supposed to be recorded from that courthouse, but somehow it still makes it to YouTube. So yeah, that always makes the weird dots there. But
Yeah, it's people that are more interested in getting views on YouTube than actually resolving violations of their civil rights. But anyway, that being said, there are some people who actually are very familiar with the law, they're very familiar with policies, they're very familiar with court decisions, and they operate in a way that does not actually get them into real legal trouble, in a way that actually helps garner awareness of the rights of people, in a way that doesn't get people to despise the First Amendment. Because if you're going into a place and you're being rude to people, and you're recording people who don't want to be recorded, and you're looking over people looking at their private information, and then you simply say, well, I can do this because of my First Amendment, and you say that very proudly, is that going to help people like the First Amendment, or is it going to get people to despise the First Amendment? Is that going to help create a situation where the First Amendment rights of people are more respected, or is that going to create a situation where people are perhaps interested in repealing the First Amendment? And
yeah, I think we all know the answer to that.
yeah, I think that that's a serious question. That the reason why we don't have certain restrictions is because we expect people to be decent in society, and so the good things we have, the rights we can have them because in our society we don't need to put harsher restrictions on people, because we're not afraid of most people doing abusing their rights in various ways. So if you go about gallivanting around, and you might not even be doing it properly, hypothetically speaking, you might not be even interpreting the law correctly, but you use certain laws to justify actions which other people see as despicable, it can create a situation that is actually harming your cause. So I think that that's something important to note. But I would like to now take a look at some websites here. So firstamendmentauditing.com is a website that I found that does talk about the First Amendment audits and such things. And it gives a number of resources on court cases that are relevant, some state cases, some national cases, and also links to various more state laws on certain things to be aware of, because there are circumstances in which your ability to remain anonymous, or your right to actively attempt to be anonymous in public, might not actually apply according to the laws of certain states. So for someone who's interested in First Amendment auditing, it's very important to know what the laws are in your jurisdiction or in the jurisdiction that you're going to. Otherwise, you end up perhaps getting into legal trouble or looking like a fool. For example, there was a guy who tried to do a First Amendment audit at a homeowners association, which is private property and therefore doesn't really fall under the same logic as general public property. And therefore, the conduct of people on private property can be regulated to a greater extent, because it's not something that's necessary for somebody's rights as a public citizen.
He did it for the views, though.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's funny that he still posted it, because I think it would be very embarrassing. for such a thing to happen.
Right. What do you? I want to bring up a question here. So, in one of the videos you sent, it was talking about some strategies that police can use or government officials can use when confronted by First Amendment auditors. And in one of those, because you know how you talk about documents and that they could, potentially view the document that could have some sensitive information. If I remember right, in that video, he mentioned a ordinance that you could pass, or I think ordinance was the word he used, but essentially make a local law in the books that can have a line that is still part of public property inside the building, and a line would be far enough away from the person filling out a document that it would be, I wouldn't say impossible, but very hard to access that information.
Yeah, so a tactic that law enforcement and other public offices use as they become more aware of First Amendment auditing and the potential of people potentially recording, legally recording sensitive information in a public place is to clearly define the distinction between public forums and non-public forums or semi-public forums. That is, places that can be public forums at certain times but not at other times. So in this case, they're talking about perhaps having areas of a building that are clearly signed as being restricted access so that people don't have access in such a place. Now, of course, such a thing would not work in places that are generally and reasonably understood as being public forums. For example, a sidewalk. You can't say limited access on a sidewalk in a public road unless it's perhaps in a military base or someplace like that. You can't put limited access on such things, or on roads that are non-private or not part of a larger facility that has limited access. So places that are generally and reasonably understood as being public forums cannot be restricted in such a way, but other places such as back rooms of government offices, courtrooms, etc., can be signed as places that are non-public forums or that are authorized personnel only, restricted access. And that is currently upheld by courts and upheld as a means that access can be restricted, that the public might not be able to immediately access certain areas. Now, of course, in certain areas you have freedom of information requests and such things, where you can gain information that might be otherwise restricted, or information after a certain time becomes publicly accessible. So there are still other ways to gain certain information and to maintain accountability of public officials when they might not be in a place that you can immediately see them.
Just remember that real quick, and I thought that was a way. And while you pull back up the website or wherever you plan to pull up next, it is kind of an interesting point I want to bring up. When you search First Amendment audits, at least on Safari, and I used it on Google too, and I believe they were the same results, maybe a little bit different here and there, but long story short, what I'm trying to say here is when you search First Amendment auditor, most of the websites that came up were about how to respond to a First Amendment audit. And it was only on like the second page where I think I found your site that you linked in the comments before we started the video on Discord, and a couple of other sites that came from a First Amendment auditor perspective. So it's kind of interesting that the first sites that were showing up were sites about how to respond to one.
Yes, I think that seems to be a trend, that the First Amendment auditing phenomenon tends to not really be centralized. It's not very well coordinated. These people are not, a lot of them are not in general association with each other than maybe on social media as social media interaction. And so you do sometimes see a number of auditors gather together to audit a particular facility, but that usually happens because you have some that are that professionally travel around doing First Amendment audits across the country, and others that might be more local. And so they might say, I'm going to do an audit in this area, and then they might show up together. So that does happen from time to time. But I would say it's not a unified movement in any way. It seems to be very ad hoc. And you can certainly see this among some First Amendment auditors who don't know exactly what the law requires and don't know what they should be doing and might run afoul of various laws. For example, they might fall afoul of trespassing or of obstruction or of loitering, because there's laws against loitering in certain areas. Disorderly conduct can be another one. And another important one that fills my mind at the moment. So I talked about trespassing, loitering, obstruction, disorderly conduct, and eavesdropping. Some areas have laws against eavesdropping, and in certain situations, such as entering a semi-public forum, there might be restrictions on what you can do. For example, if you're going into a courtroom, there might be laws against eavesdropping that apply to a courtroom, etc. So there's a number of laws that are upheld in courts and can have penalties that some of these people tend to run afoul of because they tend to operate in ignorance of what they should do. And so that is why a better one, a more polite one, that I would recommend to people to see how it is generally done in a way that is not excessive, in a way that is not trying to create an escalation, would be the channel The Batosai, where that person put out a video on how to conduct First Amendment audits. And I think it's a very good internal perspective on how audits are conducted and some general rules that some people try to follow, especially coming from someone who is not very impolite, someone who's not trying to create a reaction, someone who's relatively polite to the police and respectful of the law, and who is familiar with the laws in whichever place he is auditing, so that he doesn't get in trouble, and so that he knows exactly what he is allowed to do and what he's not allowed to do, what is legally protected activity and what is not legally protected. And so, and this is in contrast with Auditing America, who very frequently is the type that does try to escalate, who will go up to policemen, he'll film them directly in their face, he'll call them a tyrant, he I think he was the guy that went to an HOA, it might have been someone else. There's a number of these guys. After a while, they all sort of meld into one, because some of them behave quite similar to each other. But that's some interesting contrast there in behavior. But anyway, I am going to now look at the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The ones that are relevant here for First Amendment auditing are the First Amendment, the Second Amendment for something called Second Amendment auditing, and the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, which frequently come into play when contact occurs with the police. So here we go. Bill of Rights. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So, of course, the particular ones here that they're looking at is that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people to peaceably assemble. So these parts are the parts that First Amendment auditors use that justifies that they can say whatever they want in public, that they can record in public places, and that they can be present in public forums. So their presence, their ability to say what they want, and their ability to record the situation are all protected under the First Amendment, and that is the particulars of it. Amendment 2, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, of course, how exactly this is understood depends based on the state, and currently different state laws regarding gun control are enforceable, and the Supreme Court has not decided against them. But in places where you have open carry or legal concealed carry, sometimes you'll find what is a Second Amendment audit, where an auditor might perhaps be armed and stand in a public place. The police might be called on the person, and the auditor will assert that he is accomplishing a Second Amendment protected activity. Now, of course, for people who are interested in being auditors, I do want to say that it is somewhat suspicious if you are behaving in a way that is atypical. That is, if you're in a situation where the only legal reason why someone would normally be recording something or be armed in a certain area would be an First Amendment or Second Amendment audit. That is, for example, you go into some government office and you have no business there and you're simply recording. That's not something that happens anywhere except for First Amendment audits when it's legally happening. That is, of course, it might happen at times as part of a crime. And so I will say that because a First Amendment audit or Second Amendment audit is the only non-criminal situation where you would normally expect this to be happening, I think it is reasonable to say that the police would be suspicious, that they would question you. And of course, depending on your jurisdiction, you need to know your rights. But I'm just saying that from the perspective of the police, it is reasonable to question someone when someone is doing something that is highly unusual.
Right. I mean, and you could even just say anytime a gun is brought in, there's potential for it to escalate and be a lot more dangerous than simply just a First Amendment audit, even if you come in with the right intentions.
Yes. So I think it is reasonable for policemen to come up and to question you because they have a suspicion that something might be happening. Now, that being said, that's not the same as probable cause. So I think that's a very important distinction to make. But of course, it depends on the jurisdiction. Let me be very clear on that. Because a lot of these things, a lot of the ways in which the rights are enforced really depends on which state you're in and even what part of the state you're in, because there might be local laws as well. So Amendment 4, the right of a people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So this is talking about a situation wherein, in the case of First Amendment auditors, this is them recording things, and they don't have the police does not have the right to search or seize any of their property without a probable cause. And someone doing a First and Second Amendment protected activity is generally not considered a probable cause, unless perhaps you run afoul of laws relating to prowling or loitering, in which case, or harassment. That's another one that I missed from the earlier list of laws, where you might be in a situation where the character of what you're doing is changed by exactly what you're doing, and therefore you might have run afoul of one of those minor laws, and therefore there would be a probable cause for search and seizure. So I think it's very important to understand the laws once again in a jurisdiction. And the Fifth Amendment, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So the particular important element here is the part where it talks about being compelled to be a witness against yourself. So this is usually stated as the right to remain silent. That is, if a police questions you for your ID and they don't have a probable cause, then you don't have to verbally identify yourself, and you also don't have to allow them, by the Fourth Amendment, to search and seize you for your ID. Now, that being said, if they choose to do so anyway, it is general common conduct to allow the police, among First Amendment auditors, most of them will allow the police to cuff them or to search them after having protested against it. Not in the sense that they're resisting arrest, but that they question, let's say the police says, I want to see your ID, and you say, I'm not going to show it to you. And then if the police then says, I'm going to make you give your ID, I'm going to put you under arrest, then at that point, what usually happens is they'll keep their camera rolling for some time, but they will allow themselves to be arrested. And of course, depending on the situation, if they indeed were doing activities that were protected under the amendments of the Constitution, then they don't get in trouble, or they might not get in trouble, or they might even gain a settlement for the trouble that was caused to them by public officials. Or they might simply be released after it is understood that no actual crime had occurred. Mm-hmm. Now, if they were doing something that was illegal, for example, harassment, prowling, loitering, obstruction of justice, disorderly conduct or something else, then they might actually be charged with the crime and they might go to court. So I think it's important to understand that not all First Amendment auditors are equal, once again, and that some do end up running afoul of various laws.
Right. And you mentioned that one channel before, and he's kind of what I'd say is, as you mentioned, a good example of First Amendment auditors, in that I think he knows the law extremely well. And if you want to do this right, and you want to do this with the right intentions, I think you almost have to know the law extremely well. The law being where you choose to do the audits, because you can maybe know your local law, but if you go to the jurisdiction next to it or another state, even, the law can be drastically different than what your local jurisdiction is. So I think you almost have to be legal experts, not in the way that you think you know the law, the way you interpret it, but the way the law actually is. And there's no gray area in that.
Yeah, the way that the law is interpreted by the courts, the way that the law is written as statutes, and you have to understand how state and local laws interpret the Constitution and whether or not that is upheld by the higher courts. Because if you might disagree with how the law is, then rather than you might say that they've already failed the audit, and that's when you can take perhaps a civil rights action, a civil rights lawsuit against the state or local government that is doing something that could be unconstitutional. Now, of course, once again, there's some who are actually interested in gaining that consistency between the Constitution and the other laws. And then there are some who are simply interested in gaining views.
All for the views. I'm sure they're all interested in views, and I wouldn't say that even the people that are doing it 100% the right way, or at least a high percentage in the right way. It's hard to ever be 100%, but the people who are generally trying to be good at it, I think even you could argue that they're still doing it potentially for the views, just in a more accurate way, or more.
I think a good way to put it is that they're not selling out is a good way to put it. That the views are of course important, but what's also important for them is what they're doing substantially. Whereas the others are ones who prioritize the views over the civil rights aspect of First Amendment audits.
They generally believe in their cause, or believe in their. I guess you could say it's a movement. Believe in their and I'll just say believe in their cause. I think that fits it the best.
Yeah. So I also would say that whether I would recommend people to do First Amendment auditing, I would say is I think the real question is both how you do it and why you're doing it. Is it for the views, or are you doing it for civil rights? And are you simply going around looking for interactions, or are you perhaps seeing something happen in some place and you want to check it out to see if they're actually respecting civil rights? I personally am not interested in conducting First Amendment audits. I think that there's other things I could do. I would much prefer getting involved in the legislative process as a way to resolving problems and to create anti-corruption mechanisms in order to prevent the civil rights abuses that happen from happening in the first place, rather than being more reactive and seeking them out. Now, that being said, if and when such things happen, I would encourage people to seek out civil rights advocacy groups and perhaps make a lawsuit happen, or lobby politicians to look at a problem that's happening so that the problem can be resolved. But of course, it's a matter of approach, really.
That the effort that a lot of the genuine people have, it comes from a good place of knowing where your tax dollars are being spent and holding these governments accountable, being the police, being uh, the water district, being whatever government office you want to do it in. Just making sure your tax dollars are spent right and things are running the right way.
Yeah.
Now, once again, how you go about it, I think, is really the focus. And if you do want to be a First Amendment auditor, I would highly suggest the first channel's approach rather than the second channel's approach, because I think that you have to have a perspective of wanting to do this in the right way. Because if you come from it at wanting to do it for the views, then I don't really think that you're really helping the cause any. And you could even argue that you could hurt the cause because you may cause the police to become more closed off to the public.
Yeah, and also, if you're going to cause a scene that leads to 5 different police cars to arrive, and you're going to sit on your high horse about taxpayer money when you're really wasting the time of a police that they could possibly be spending fighting actual real crime, I think that is perhaps a problematic approach. To fabricate a situation in order to examine it rather than looking at the regular performance of a police. It's what I'm saying is it's adding stress to the system and adding stress to your tax dollars that doesn't need to be there, when instead you could simply ask, how are people treated when they're being arrested, when there's something criminal? What are the policies that the police has in place? And looking at ways that you can address civil rights issues without having to waste the time of the police and waste the public's tax dollars. Because what's important to understand is, while it is said that public officials work for us, they don't exclusively work for the small us. That is the small group. That is to say, when the policemen in my town, they don't work for me personally. They work for the town collectively through the corporate structure of the city. And as such, what we have to understand is that other taxpayers also have their interests as well, and their preference to how their tax dollars are spent. And so understanding that whenever you're interacting with police, you're not only interacting with someone who is a public servant to you, but you're interacting with someone who is a public servant to someone else. And having that in mind helps you understand why there's a significant group of people that are very uncomfortable or derisive with the idea of First Amendment audits, because they consider it to be a waste of time and money.
Almost counterintuitive to what they're trying to attempt to do. Because especially if you end up creating the commotion, like you've already mentioned, then what you're trying to do by exposing potential bads, you're only just making another one happen. So they're not really exposing anything. It would be more efficient to almost like interview someone who may have been arrested and said that they were mistreated, or do things like that, and, as you mentioned, work it from a more legislative angle than a First Amendment angle. But once again, I don't necessarily think that their focus and their goal of what they do is necessarily bad. It's just I think it could be spent better or used better.
Yeah, and I think that that's a criticism that some people have against First Amendment auditors is that the criticism is that they could be doing something that is more productive with their time. Now, that being said, you could say that about anything people do as a hobby because, or as a job. So I don't think that that's a particularly strong argument, but I will say that it is important to understand that these things don't happen in a vacuum, that there's a broader society that interacts with public officials and who might have opinions about the actions of First Amendment auditors. So while I do think that there are some First Amendment auditors who are doing a commendable job and who are doing things very well, I think that there's also a disproportionately large amount of them that don't know what they're doing or are doing things improperly or are doing things that are indeed wasteful of taxpayer money and getting and therefore it's very important for awareness among First Amendment auditors on how they should do their audits and on understanding ways to act that are also considered respectable by the general society if they want to preserve their right to continue to do First Amendment audits. Because if you end up upsetting society to a large degree, what will happen is that the rights will be curtailed. And this isn't something that is hypothetical. This has happened in some countries, and it can happen here. No place is eternally resistant to attempts of people to change the law and to change rights. And there are people that say that rights are actively being eroded in some ways. And if you take those people seriously, then you also have to understand that if the public then becomes in favor of those rights being eroded, it can lead to a major problem.
Sure.
Yeah. I think another thing to note about First Amendment audits is that there are also some similar ideas, probably not called First Amendment audits, similar types of actions that do occur in other countries other than the United States. Although exactly how they work and exactly how the exact rights that exist are involved, I'm not entirely familiar with, and of course it would be a huge topic to look into any particular country on how it works. But it's also funny when you see somebody in another country talk about the First Amendment to a police officer when they don't have that.
Yeah, they're like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah. Or speaking of people bringing things out of context into other countries, for example, I saw a video where a sovereign citizen started talking about traveling in Mexico. The sovereign citizen traveling. He was talking to a police officer, and they weren't even speaking the same language. He couldn't understand each other, and he had an interpreter sitting next to him. But when someone said you could have just simply used the interpreter, but then he said that then he would have had to charge the officer money to use the interpreter, but typical sovereign citizen. But anyway, First Amendment auditors are not like sovereign citizens. A lot of First Amendment auditors actually respect the law and are interested in being law-abiding citizens. Now, of course, general rules of some, not all, apply, that there are some bad eggs, and some of these are very prominent, and that's partially because the types of videos that get the most views are the types of videos where the situation escalates. So
Yeah. The YouTube algorithm likes those a lot more than educational videos.
yeah, or simply a video where you see a sign at the door and the audit fails immediately. So then you write up a formal complaint to the city, and then the city doesn't respond. So you put in a lawsuit or something. So yeah, yeah, that or the one where you ask if you can record in the building and you don't have the camera on right away, and then they say no. So then instead of starting to record in the building anyway and getting in trouble with the law, you leave the building and put in a formal complaint. But
Those
of
are
course,
drilling videos.
and then you simply record yourself on the other side of a road from the on the sidewalk, as the media usually does, talking about how they didn't let you record inside the building, and how you were a law-abiding citizen who respected their policy of not having recordings, but you're still going to put in a complaint. Because that's not an interesting video to watch. That's just some guy talking about some legal situation that happened, and there's no drama. There's just a, well, they didn't let me record, so I didn't record, and now I'm just talking to you about how they didn't let me record and how I'm going to put in a complaint.
You have to get the real legal nerds to like that content.
Yeah, yeah. But if a lot more of them actually operated that way, and of course that's other than the ones of course that are already, because if you're on the sidewalk you can record all you want, so that's not a problem. I'm just talking about the ones that want to record in places where they're not allowed to record. If a lot of them, if a lot more of them acted that way, I think the movement would have a more favorable perception. But the problem is that they also would have a much smaller profile and a much smaller following, because you don't get the popcorn moments that go into the frauditor compilations.
Right. And I've seen the sidewalk thing get abused, I guess you could say, are used in the wrong way before too, on some of the audits. So I think they would kind of count more towards the fraudster angle of this, such as the police. I think this was at the police station, if I remember right on this clip. But long story short, the police were there and they had a woman in the background, and the police officer was talking to the auditor who was on the sidewalk, public property, and he was recording kind of what was happening. And I think this would technically count towards obstructing the scene, just a little bit, but I'll explain what happened. So anyway, the police officer was trying to block the what was happening, and he was saying that he was trying to block, the police interaction with the person. But the person on the YouTube video I watched was saying that it was the police officer trying to block the person from viewing the person who was about to be interviewed, about whatever happened with what happened with her. So you can kind of see
domestic violence victim.
I think it was domestic violence.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact details, but
And,
yes.
and that's the interesting thing about domestic violence victims, witness protection, jurors coming in and out of courtrooms. It's one of those things where there might be laws in certain jurisdictions where trying to investigate such things is restricted, but also, even if there aren't laws on that, what you should do is simply not point the camera in that direction and tell the officer that they should perhaps have better security measures.
Right.
But what they do then is they record them anyway, because it baffles me why. They do it because they can.
Right. Because in the video, he was walking to the side of the officer. The officer was following him. Then he went to the other side. Like, you could obviously tell that he was trying to record the person. Like, there was no doubts about it.
Yeah. So I think one important takeaway here is just because you can legally do something doesn't mean you should do something. For example, just because you can legally lie about various things in public doesn't mean you should lie about various things in public. And that's what you see with some frauditors is they'll go into a DMV and they'll say, "Oh, I'm part of a press," and then they say, "Well, you don't have any business here," and then they'll change their story and say, "Actually, I'm here to get a form on something," even though they're not getting the form. So just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. Just because you can record a domestic violence victim doesn't mean that it's a decent thing to record a domestic violence victim.
Right. You'd think that would be almost common sense, but I guess it not so much common sense.
Yeah, that's the situation where the person is too interested in getting views and in promoting a reaction from the police.
For the views.
Yeah. But anyway, I think that we've talked about this quite enough. I think we've covered our bases on different elements of the movement and on things that can happen. And of course, there's all sorts of different court cases. For example, it's still important to understand that it is legal to record the police. It is legal to record in public places. There is no legal expectation of privacy in public. But that being said, don't abuse your rights. Don't enter into a situation where people will hate the First Amendment because of your actions.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we should close out then. Thank you all for watching, our beautiful audience. Tell us what you think in the comments section below. Or if you have perhaps some ideas for a future show, feel free to share that with us as well. We're always happy to take ideas on board.
For sure. And next week we'll be on my channel, The Breakdown with Berckenhoff on YouTube, or The Breakdown with WB on all other live stream platforms. And catch you on the next one.
Yeah. So thank you all for watching. This is my book, Actionable Justice. And we'll be seeing you all next time. Goodbye.